A response to philosophical critiques of Landian accelerationism. Introduction. A significant line of criticism levied against Nikland's accelerationism is that it neglects the reterritorialization portion of the deterritorialization process and is thus inconsistent with its supposed foundational Deleuze-Guattarian theory, an inconsistency which leads to a conceptual confusion between speed and acceleration, thereby undermining the novelty of the accelerationist project. This body of criticism neglects the concept of fiction which, when appropriately considered, suggests that Nikland's project is consistent with the oeuvre of Deleuze and Guattari's project. More importantly, at the same time, whether Nikland's project is or is not consistent with Deleuze and Guattari's project is a misguided question, and of little consequence. Critiquing Land for inconsistency, incoherence, or error regarding reterritorialization is the very kind of state-oriented reterritorialization D&G explicitly warned against, and which Land's project was attempting to think beyond. What follows from these explorations, I suggest, is an emphasis on aesthetic experience, and a reconsideration of reterritorialization as, to use a reductive term loosely, nothing other than deterritorialization in its latent or virtual state. In other words, acceleration is inevitable, though unverifiable, ontologically redundant, or even nonsensical. This slogan nonetheless illustrates something that can be experienced through literature and music, and which merits further mapping. With this said, I feel compelled to end on a warning. In this text the reader will find diagrams that map poorly onto their written counterparts, equations that are speculative to the extent that they border on meaninglessness, a complete lack of formal arguments, and a cumbersome style that at times is far too reliant on large excerpts of other texts. To make matters worse, I have only discussed what interests me, and have made no effort to present the other side of the discussion. It is your place, reader, to add what I missed. Your place to connect your machine to mine. Enjoy. Pseudonym, DCB ticker. Response to philosophical critiques of Landian accelerationism. 4.1 or several critiques. 1.1. Land's deviation from their, Deleuze and Guattari's, understanding of capitalism is fatal. Land collapses capitalism into schizophrenia, thus losing their most crucial insight into the way that capitalism operates via simultaneous processes of deterritorialization and compensatory reterritorialization. Fisher. One wouldn't need to deterritorialize and destratify unless there was always a complement of reterritorialization and restratification. Although the real itself is absolutely deterritorialized, it's always differentiated and stratified. There must be a limit-trophic point of absolute deterritorialization towards which the process of affirmation or acceleration tends. If you're accelerating, there are material constraints upon your capacity to accelerate, but there must also be a transcendental speed limit at some point. The continuation or intensification of the process demands the elimination of humanity as a substrate for the process. Here I think a conceptual incoherence emerges. How can you intensify when there is no longer anything left to intensify? There comes a point at which there is no agency left. Brassier. Land celebrates absolute deterritorialization as liberation to the point of total disintegration and death. He simply ignores the reactive side of capitalism in Deleuze and Guattari's account, the side that blocks its own liberatory potentials by operating a violent and artificial reterritorialization. Xavier 03. Deleuze and Guattari recognized, what capitalist speed deterritorializes with one hand, it reterritorializes with the other. Land confuses speed with acceleration. Landian accelerationism is stuck in a localized ramping up of intensity, rather than a more properly accelerative regime capable of navigating beyond the capitalist axiomatic. Williams. For the basic critique, Land's theories are incoherent or erred due to his overlooking the nuances of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of deterritorialization processes wherein capitalism, the organism, doubles down on what it changes, thereby preventing escape beyond certain limits inherent to the organization, a missed complexity that results, so it is implied, from Land's ignorance of the important theoretical changes made to the concept of Deterritorialization between Anti-Oedipus and 8000 plateaus, OW and ATP from here on out. 1.2. In his short text Excavating the Origins of Accelerationism, 2017, Vincent Garton succinctly condenses the above critiques before illustrating their common error. A criticism often leveled at Land is his supposed inadequacy as a reader of Deleuze and Guattari. This is at root an intellectual historical argument. An intellectual historical argument, Garton insists, predicated on shaky speculation of the intent behind Land's behavior. Garton continues, the CCRU were competent and interesting investigators of Deleuze and Guattari precisely because they did not assume the posture of historicists recovering what these writers actually thought, or of scholars contributing a new and convincing reading to a burgeoning field of scholarship. Land and the CCRU were not attempting to accurately explicate or interpret D and G as much as they were attempting to do D and G, much like they were attempting to do cybernetics. In Deleuze or Guattarian jargon, the CCRU constructed literary and conceptual machines that plugged into the DG machines, and machines do not correspond to accurate-inaccurate, coherent-incoherent, and right-wrong binary coordinates. They work in fits and starts where error and fiction are just as much a part of the workings as anything else. As Land writes himself, nothing logical ever happens at the level of machines. 6. For these reasons, Garton argues, the intellectual historical critique is misguided. 7. 1.3 What Garton does not expand on, to no fault of his own, is that these critiques misunderstand the main thrust of Land's accelerationist project by overlooking the conceptual and literary consistencies between early Land CCRU texts and excerpts of Deleuze and Guattari's ATP, which both feature deterritorializing, hyperstitional, theory-fictional characters. It is in these consistencies that the solution to the theoretical incoherencies or errors arises. A model of thought that abandons any recourse to classical notions of incoherence caused by collapsed differences, an aesthetic paradigm of the machinic hyperreal wherein fiction breaks down distinctions and becomes an articulation of reality as opposed to a mere representation of reality. 2. Deterritorialization. 2.1. Is Landian acceleration that fatally incoherent due to its supposed ignorance of the theoretical developments made between now and ATP? Does it matter? To begin, let's look at some excerpts from ATP concerning the organism's relation to distratification. On page 70 of ATP, 8. Absolute deterritorialization is there from the beginning, and the strata are thickenings on a plane of consistency. The abstract machine exists half erected in certain strata whose form of prehension it defines a memory or tension. The plane of consistency retains just enough of the strata to extract from them variables that operate in the plane of consistency. On page 150-151, in the plateau How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs? You can botch it, it can lead you to your death. You never reach the body without organs. It is a limit as a rule imminent to experimentation. Why not walk on your head, sing with your sinuses, see through your skin, breathe with your belly? Where psychoanalysis says, stop, find yourself again, we should say instead, let's go further still, we haven't found our bow yet. Similarly, on page 160-161, you have to keep enough of the organism for it to reform each dawn, and you have to keep small supplies of signifiance and subjectification, if only to turn them against their own systems when the circumstances demand it, when things force you to, and you have to keep small rations of subjectivity in sufficient quantity to enable you to respond to the dominant reality. Mimic the strata. You don't reach the bow by wildly distratifying. There are several ways of botching the bow. If you blow apart the strata without taking precautions, you will be killed. This is how it should be done. Lodge yourself on a stratum, experiment with the opportunities it offers, find an advantageous place on it, possible lines of flight, experience them, have a small plot of new land at all times. It is through a meticulous relation with the strata that one succeeds in freeing lines of flight. We are in a social formation. First see how it is stratified for us and in us, and at the place where we are it is only there that the bow reveals itself for what it is, a long process of experimentation becoming animal, becoming molecular, for it is not my body without organs, instead the me is on it, or what remains of me, unalterable and changing in form, crossing thresholds. 2.2. Absolute deterritorialization is the unknowable real or base material, a sort of prebiotic corporeal soup and its incorporeal quanta of possibilities, that matter gives form to. An impersonal reservoir, though D and G discourage this metaphor, of flows and forces from which form pulls to distribute across a plane, segmenting into strata or layers, via half-erected abstract machines whose form of prehension carries a memory. As Xavier 09 points out in his book on Kant, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Guattari, and aesthetics, D and G were keen on Alfred North Whitehead, so it's not surprising that we see his concept prehension in use. Like with Whitehead, one can infer that this concept, when coupled with the line regarding memory, is used to refer to a kind of virtual incorporeal mnemic vector that conditions possibilities and creates a sense of continuity in otherwise disparate material fragments. From this model, it follows that a quanta of possibilities is distributed, a distribution which, for every choice or articulation made out of the base material, births a trajectory of influence or vector that reinforces certain processes while de-emphasizing others, feedback that leads to divergent or convergent paths. Through stratification and distratification and their feedback cycles, which are machined by the abstract machine that straddles a borderline space, an ontological minima of strata, just enough, is kept in order to be used as a stimuli or trigger or reinforce certain processes and de-emphasize others, i.e., to further a vector, or prehension, of distratification. The sort of Nietzschean riddle one ought not to have oughts, or the only ought one ought to have is an ought that permits one to have less oughts. 10. We see this evidenced in the many lines regarding the need to keep enough of the organism of a small plot of land, keep small supplies to turn them against their own systems. This is because distratifying or deterritorializing, making one's self a bow, can be botched. Do it too quickly and you go psychotic or die. It's not a goal one rushes to achieve, but a limit flirting process leaning towards the unthinkable, unrepresentable and incoherent, the outside, noumena, etc., which requires a bare minimum of strata as a kind of re-anchoring point to re-trigger distratification, turn against own cis. Instead of going psychotic, as typical clinical schizophrenia, is an autistic-like shutting out of the world, as opposed to D and G, Land's use of the term, which is an intense engagement with the world. One is urged to mimic or lodge with a strata, engagement or affirmation, as opposed to disengagement or negation. 11. And experiment through meticulous relation with the dominant reality of a social formation in us in a diagrammatic manner, a dynamic and effective way, as opposed to a simple rational or cognitive one. The CCIU's hyperstition is a diagrammatic and assigning approach whereby a fiction is made real through the systems of the body and the outside, intensifying coincidences. We know this as acceleration. After all, deterritorialization is the only thing accelerationism has ever really talked about. 12. We don't critique the strata, we don't negate the strata or refuse it, we learn its curvatures and topographies and manipulate and extort them, making them go against their nature and therefore, through feedback processes, change their nature. A minimum is retained so that the minimum itself can be used to further reduce and alter that minimum. This is in fact the reterritorialization to which our critics are referring. However, reterritorialization is just deterritorialization in its latent or virtual state. Reterritorialization is just deterritorialization waiting to happen. The stratified remainder is an anchor point pulling the distratified into further distratification. It's not that agency is destroyed, and therefore there is nothing left to accelerate, but rather, agency is altered, becomes something truly other, as opposed to alterity in advance. 13, something outside, animal, and alien. 2.3. To aid in our understanding of these excerpts and my explication of them, we turn to an earlier portion of ATP. On page 3, D and G ease us into their text by introducing the above themes in clear, non-theoretical language. Each of us was several. Why have we kept our own names? Purely out of habit, also because it's nice to talk like everybody else, to say the sun rises, when everybody knows it's only a manner of speaking. They continue on page 2021. We employ a dualism of models to arrive at a process that challenges all models. Mental correctives are necessary to undo the dualisms we had no wish to construct, but through which we pass via all the dualisms that are the enemy. An entirely necessary enemy. Use the unavoidable and necessary, the forced demands of a minima of retained strata, small supplies, etc. To alter the unavoidable and necessary, minima retained strata turned against the system itself. The reterritorializations of the limit, static habits, manners of speech, reductive dualism, are a means to escape the limit itself. In fact, the limit is the only thing with enough diagrammatic effect to generate force enough to escape itself. Limits, where the frothing, Heraclitean sea of base material ossifies and crystallizes into a fixed reference point, are storages of frozen, virtual energy to be appropriated towards disintegration. Crystal meth, anyone? This is the novel observation of accelerationism. We don't fight with the reality, our habits and traditions, which inevitably leads to miserablism, resentment, neurosis, psychosis, etc. We get in touch with reality, through aesthetic experiences, fictional or semi-fictional narratives, ego, social contracts, etc. and their cybernetic feedback, and explore the habits and traditions as parts of the real, the social in us. We find the places where things are captured and locked into place, stasis, and we too find the places that are loose and able to be swayed with and broken down, dynamism. We use our habits, internal milieu, and our habitat, external milieu, the tools at our disposal, to achieve something else, something alien. This is acceleration. Leaning into the real, using the real and its crystallized structures to follow a line of distratification. 14 To condense these notions of change, natural, alien, and outside, into maximum density, and in doing so capture the oft-overlooked female contributions to the CCRU, Sadie Plant, Anna Greenspan, Lucy Unaparasi, Lucy Riga-Ray, Suzanne Livingston. We will simply adjust Laboria Cubonics xenofeminist aphorism: if nature is unjust, change nature to if nature is always reterritorialized, stratified, and differentiated, change nature. 3. Musical deterritorialization. 3.1. To return to our critiques, that Land misses the reterritorialization latent in deterritorialization because he has not read ATP. We must say, A. It is not clear that Landian acceleration is inconsistent with ATP. Furthermore, though we have not spent much if any time attempting to show this, it's not clear that ATP markedly departs from our other than in linguistic conceptual changes which are likely the result of a general sense of maturity. Grandpa Gilles and Uncle Felix. We are 10 years older now. Don't accelerate too fast or you'll die, you idiot, and a sober response to the overwhelming critical shrieks about valorizing schizophrenia. This leaves the core philosophical values more consistent with our, and therefore indirectly Land as well, than inconsistent. 16 For example, not only do D and G not retract their suggestion to going further still in ATP, they reiterate it. Let's go further still. We haven't found our bow yet, we haven't sufficiently dismantled ourself. B. Yes, of course, deterritorializing or distratifying necessarily requires a complementary reterritorialization or stratification, a surplus which is never quite eradicated. On our anthropocentric plane of consistency, our human universe, matter, no matter how dispersed, still retains some level of form, and the human, no matter how dispersed, still retains some level of humanity. Meanwhile, A surplus churns away, orbiting zero, circling the drain, only to crawl up again from the depths like some unnameable creature each time we think it's over. This is, if we recall from 2.2 above, the borderline space of just enough, where the bow and its relative limits are approached. As Land was rumored to have said in passing, the human always finds a way back. 3.2 An irreducible surplus of reterritorialization does not necessitate that a limit is itself a hindrance to meaningful acceleration away from the limit. The limit is repurposed, like the kipple used by cargo cultures, towards the objective of reducing its very own limits. The limit is precisely that which leverages acceleration, charges momentum, etc. despite being highly speculative, and admittedly begging the question. A simple thought experiment may demonstrate the point. Imagine a system in which for every 2 quantity of deterritorialization there is 1 quantity of reterritorialization, a 2-to-1 ratio. There will always be reterritorialization, but the process will always tend towards greater deterritorialization with an always smaller reterritorialization. With each wave of deterritorialization that occurs, the system becomes less stable. And so when it does reterritorialize, its strata or stable and fixed territory becomes smaller, less significant than before, and therefore, because it is acting as a limit reference point or anchor for charging future processes, exerts less pressure, or prehension, towards stability. Destabilization begets more destabilization. This increases the tendency for deterritorialization of the strata or fixed territory. Certain processes are enforced at the expense of other processes being de-emphasized. This is what Land continually refers to as a positive cybernetic feedback loop. A diagram may help clarify. Figure 1, the diagrammatic referential loop process of re- and deterritorialization. As a relatively stable territory, square, deterritorializes, solid arrow and circle. Its abstract machines reach back in time and pull vector charge from the in-between, dissipated portion of the process, dotted lines and triangles, to apply to the next deterritorialization. It is understandable that this speculative and perhaps uninformed diagram may obscure the process we are attempting to discuss more than clarify. So the following section will attempt to provide a concrete and clear example of what I am calling the diagrammatic referential process of re- and deterritorialization. 3.3 I plug my electric guitar into my delay, echo, pedal and then into my amplifier. I set the repeat knob to high, i.e. how many times the echo plays back. I play 1 note. The first strike of the note contains the quality and nature of the note, an A440Hz, but soon the echo effect produced by the little machine overcomes the original note and now the echo of the note, and its implied microtonal under, overtones or partials, i.e., subtle variations in note, pitch, i.e., deterritorialization, is being caught in the echo effect. So we now have an echo of an echo, or feedback, oscillation, simulacrum. The original note is lost, and the first copy of the original degrades, loses its tonal territory, takes on other resonances, and is now open to drift from an A440Hz to whatever frequency is most resonant in the assemblage of the room, the guitar pickups, the amplifier, and the echo pedal. Through shifting reference points induced by a machine, a stable pitch opens up to the outside. See Figure 2 below. Figure 2, Advanced technologies invoke ancient entities. The human voice disintegrates into the howl of cosmic trauma. Ray Brassier and Robin Mackay in their editor's introduction of Nick Land's collective writings Fanged Noumena. Given Patchwork's libertarian overtones, pun intended, and the CCR use, Land's let the process take control as opposed to the humanist hand of influence pathos. One may also think here of the economic concept, the invisible hand of the market. As seen in the diagram, the human hand strumming the guitar is overcome by the machine feedback process. As anyone who has played into a full stack of amps, with or without a delay pedal, knows, the machines will produce feedback that runs away and overcomes the player and the signal. In this sense, What is playing you will indeed make it to level 2. Just as Alvin Lucier 18 demonstrated in 1969, the microtonal differentials that are picked up most significantly in the echo drift will continue to reinforce themselves, thus de-emphasizing other notes, and the drift will ramp up until the note has changed. A complex vocal passage, anthropomorphic content, will melt into a simple melodic passage, abstract form. What is more, the minimal strata that remains, in charging the process in a direction of minimizing itself further, effectively alters its own nature. This is true with any feedback process such as guitar amplifier distortion or fuzz effects wherein quantity, i.e. hard or soft strumming with the hand, amount of force, effects quality, i.e. tonality of distortion or fuzz coloring the clean signal of the guitar amp. As is the case with hyperreality, form and expression, or content, are relative. Their limits give way and rearrange. Not unlike the A440 note and its echo, an organism deterritorializes. And each time the returns from the destratification process wash up on the shores of the remaining strata, this alters the strata that acts as the reference point for launching the next deterritorialization. A dynamic diagrammatic process where the reference point for the next process is always shifting or different than before. Before long, the strata that remained has shifted and morphed, perhaps even become animal or alien. 4. Sarkin and Acceleration 4.1 Part of the re/deterritorialization critique levied against Land is that he confuses speed for acceleration. The thinking is that unavoidable stratification or reterritorialization necessarily implies a limit which captures the destratification process in a closed register of speed, Lucier's voice getting faster and faster until it is a high-pitched shrill, as it would be if you increased the playback speed digitally or on a tape recorder, rather than an open register of acceleration. The vocal passage morphing into a melodic passage, as it does in the experiment, through accelerative drift. Acceleration changes form, which changes content, which changes form. Speed superficially alters content but retains much of the content and all of the form. Critiques such as these neglect Land's earlier work with the CCRU, which offers us fictional examples of acceleration as opposed to speed, examples of what a destratified or deterritorialized process pushed beyond an anthropocentric transcendental limit looks like, unlife, as opposed to a speedy, human death. These are characters who become merged and meshed with the real of the outside through diagrammatic or non-representational technologies that blend ancient myth and future tech in a temporal loop with madness. The clearest and most elaborated example of this is the hyperstitional character Oscar Sarkin. To put Sarkin and destratification in context, take the following excerpt from ATP. A line of flight arises when the associated milieu is rocked by blows from the exterior, forcing the animal to lean on its interior milieus. When the seas dried, the primitive fish left its associated milieu to explore land, forced to stand on its own legs, now carrying water only on the inside, in the amniotic membrane's territorialities. Then, are shot through with lines of flight testifying to movements of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. The epistrato and parastrato are continually moving, sliding, shifting, and changing on the unity of composition of a stratum, our delay pedal drifting reference point. Some are swept away by lines of flight and movements of deterritorialization, but they all communicate at the intersection of the milieus, like Lucier's tape loop. The strata are continually being shaken by phenomena of cracking and rupture at the level of the substrata that furnish the materials, a prebiotic soup, a pre-chemical soup. Everywhere there arise simultaneous accelerations and blockages, comparative speeds, differences in deterritorialization creating relative fields of reterritorialization, page 76. Through processes of acceleration, or deterritorialization, the outside gets on the inside, and the inside reorganizes as to allow a new outside to be traversed. Reference points shift and drift as in Figure 1 and 2. Now let's look at this in practice through Land-associated CCRU texts. 4.2 A slew of essays in Part 6, Sarkin, Pursuit of the Machine Diagonal of CCRU. Writings 1997 to 2003, 2018 page 167 210 describe Anthropol agents picking over the ruins of Oscar Sarkin's lab after its digital Chernobyl, page 172, a singularity event which spawned a schizophrenic AI that would go on to serve as a model for an AI-operated asylum. Expanding on this AI and Sarkin, land, presumably, in a semi-sardonic but detailed mixture of narrative description and dialogic interaction between characters, writes, by the turn of the millennium 700 million years of biological evolution had been recapitulated in 70 years of technical development, leading to AI programs running approximately equivalent to the brain power of a guppy. Techno-capitalist trends involve positive nonlinearities, increasing returns, or runaway trajectories, compressions. A given price doubled each year in the 1990s, after doubling every 18 months in the 1980s, and every 2 years before that. Extensive accelerations described by positive exponentials, or doubling periods, occult zones of true time compression, page 178. A recapitulative process of acceleration, not unlike the diagrammatic referential process in Figure 1 and 2, is charged by technocapitalism. He continues. Moravec, colleague of Sarkin, develops an elaborate project, a planned obsolescence of the organic body, and of the senses you are transported to the technosurgical interface. Robot surgeons wait to convert your subjective identity into a computer-compatible format. Your skull is anesthetized, but your brain remains awake. It is scanned and destroyed by nanotechnical instruments, one layer or stratum, myotalics, at a time. You migrate into software that precisely models the behavior of the scanned tissue, and brain activity is replaced by its digital simulation. The medical examination has become indistinguishable from the operation. Form and expression or content relativize. Scanning is transplantation. Already lurking in the near future is an evolutionary leap takeover by computer programs. Sarkin's research culminates in a digital unlife. Although unimaginably ancient, it seems to emerge out of a neuroelectronic apparatus. Page 179-183. Technology allows for a literal distratification wherein differences between subject, organism and object, milieu converge. Content and expression are relative for D and G, simulation and hyperreal for Baudrillard. The medium is the message for McLuhan, all of which Fisher points out in his Gothic flatline thesis, are essential to hyperstition or hyperfiction. Not unlike the recapitulative process of evolution, unancient unlife, the deep past of unconditional deterritorialism, prebiotic soup, is accessed through the future reaching back and pulling the past towards it. Similarly, the essay in the Sarkin section of the CCRU texts entitled Between and Beneath the Net, a title which warrants mention due to its theoretical allusions to the way D and G described the plane of consistency and its abstract machines, describes MIT scientist Minsky pontificating about his colleague, Sarkin. Minsky reminisces aloud, "Have you seen Oscar lately, Marvin? He's wired up to some sort of interface gizmo, and it seems to be eating him, gnawing at him on a molecular level as if they're melting or rotting together." Take the Sarkin zip. It enables brain function to be fused onto virtual processor states. Once it's running, you can't unpick the zigzag of who's what as it hums. Total meshing. This is no longer technology, but something else. True interlinkage, an unprogrammable raw connectivity beneath and between the net. Page 185-186. Before ending the text, the CCRU connects this back to the idea of singularity. They say Axis went mad. First computer system to undergo psychotic collapse, but Sarkin argues that it just learnt to think. They speak of something crawling under the net, some kind of quantum unlife intelligence you certainly can't ignore. You'd end up like Sarkin, you'd have to be crazy to go there. Into Cyberch's mesh cults where life doesn't matter anymore. Continuing the theme of techno-merger, as mentioned above, the AI Sarkin birthed in his digital Chernobyl incident was used to model an AI-driven asylum for the insane. This AI which keeps track of psychotics runs away into escalating disorder. Overwhelming automatic inhibitors. The singularity takes over, mobilizing its capabilities to intensify its own propagation, become auto-excitational and self-disorganizing. Page 198-199. As a final example, one that brings us explicitly back to D and G's primitive fission amniotic membranes in ATP, take an earlier CCRU text focused on aquatic distratifying and the bow. Maximilian Crabbe, subaquatic researcher and entrepreneur, 1940, 1999. Oscar Sarkins reflects on one his associates, Crabbe. Many assumed Crabbe was dead, but Crabbe's own body was distributed between 72 cybernetically regulated biohazard pressure vats, scattered throughout BP1. His meta-amoebic regression had reached such a nadir of disorganization that the only motive power remaining to him was slow sloshing. Page 142-143. An assemblage of unlife. Through processes of acceleration, the outside gets on the inside, which is itself the outside folded in, and the inside reorganizes as to allow a new outside to be traversed. Reference points shift and drift. The result is the merger of what was once the individuated human into its environment to the extent that neither is distinguishable from the other, into a unity crawling with infectious techo-organic multiplicities, articulations of base material, etc. A true desiring machine, a concept which, after all, was an attempt to break down the archaic divide between mechanism and vitalism. As D and G mentioned earlier, the bow is necessarily a plane. Necessarily a collectivity, for it is not my body without organs, instead the me is on it, or what remains of me, unalterable and changing in form, crossing thresholds. Agency is old news. No one is hurtling towards death here, only riding the future into ancient unlife. Put reductively, as D.C. Barker's research illustrates, the human organism, and with it the subject, evolved from the deep tensions of the earth. So it is fitting that through technology, the adventure known as life returns to where it started. 4.3 Before moving on to Challenger, let's quickly elaborate on techocapitalism and its doubling of the merging process, extensive accelerations, positive exponentials. Taken from the earlier quote, a given price doubled each year in the 1990s, after doubling every 18 months in the 1980s. And every 2 years before that. Let P stand for price, Y stand for year, 10 stand for double, number stand for quantity, PX, 2Y. Price doubled every 2 years in the 70s, PX: 1.5Y. Price doubled every year and a half in the 80s, PX: 1Y. Price doubled each year in the 90s, or, for every quantity of year, price doubled at half quantity. The rate, A, $1 asterisk doubled or multiplied by 2, per 2 years, B, 2 asterisk 2 to 1.5, C, 4 asterisk 2 to 1, D, 8 asterisk 2 0.5, E, 16 asterisk 2 0.25, F, 32 asterisk 2 0.125, G, 64 asterisk 2 0.0625, H, 128 asterisk 2 0.03125, I, 256 asterisk 2 0.015625, J, 512 asterisk 2, 0.0078125, K, 1024 asterisk 2 0.00390625, L, 2048 asterisk 2, 0.0019533125, etc. This is clearly acceleration. Speed is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, i.e., a rate of change of 1. Acceleration is 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, 15, 20, 28, i.e., a rate of change of 1, then 2, then 3, then 5, then 8, and further. The rate of change between the rate of change is 1 for the first 6 numbers, a difference of 1 between 1 and 2 and 3, then 2, a difference of 2 between 3 and 5, then 3, difference of 3 between 5 and 8, etc. This can also be expressed exponentially in a number of ways. These exponentials, in line with section 2, figure 1, can also be expressed as ratios. Ratio and rate derive from the same etymological root, and according to the basic dictionary definition, a ratio is a rate or relation between two magnitudes. Likewise, definitions of speed and acceleration are: speed equals distance, time. If t is the distance covered by a body in time t, then its speed is s equals dt. Acceleration is defined as the rate of change of velocity. Acceleration is the change in velocity per unit time. If a body has uniform velocity, its acceleration is 0. For a body to have acceleration, there must be a change in its velocity. Thus, acceleration equals velocity, time. If v is the velocity of the body and t is the time taken by the body to achieve the velocity v, then its acceleration may be understood as a equals vt. Summary: speed is the distance covered in a unit of time, while acceleration is the rate of change of speed. Speed is molar and linear, 2 greater than 1, acceleration is molecular and complex, 2:1 ratio, 5:3r, 9:6r, etc. Speed, 50 miles per hour is faster than 40 miles per hour. Acceleration, 40 to 50 in 2 seconds, 40 to 50 in 1 second, 50 to 70 in 1 second, 70 to 100 in 0.5 second, etc. Speed is simple difference, while acceleration is a set of differential relations between relative speeds. It's clear Land is conceptualizing acceleration, a rate of change between speed, not a simple change in speed. The limit is displaced and runaway keeps running and running and running and running, and the organism end up as a non-representational merger between a human organism and a technomytho environment, a monster that is not provable by philosophical debate, but accessed through aesthetic experience, and illustrated by literary description. The organism does not die, i.e., hit a transcendental limit where the agency needed to propel distratification dissipates. The organism becomes the milieu by mimicking or meshing with the strata, the absolute deterritorialized, between the web, where the abstract machine lies. So, the ontologically minimal strata, just enough that D and G spoke of, does not necessarily denote an organism's death, but an unlife in the form of a merger with the outside milieu, with the territorial strata, the cosmic non-romantic energetics. The deterritorialized entity is an articulation of the milieu, or geotrauma. We must recall that acceleration is nothing other than a theory of time, and all it's ever talked about is deterritorialization. 5. Challenger and Acceleration 5.1 Whether Land neglected to read ATP and therefore missed the developments made to concept of deterritorialization doesn't really matter. But if he did read ATP- which he did, he would have only needed to read the first few plateaus, as it is here that the ideas relevant to Land's project and the critiques levied against it occur. The third plateau, 10,000 B.C., the geology of morals. Who does the Earth think it is mandatory reading for Nick Land's new Center for Research and Practice class on metapolitics. In Class 2, Land and his students discuss Professor Challenger and deterritorialization. Upon reading the plateau, one can easily see how much of its form and content were recapitulated in the early CCRU and later Landian, though. The plateau is written from the perspective of an audience member in a lecture of Professor Challenger. Challenger, whose profession is hard to pin down, begins feverishly talking about the Earth, territories, geological stratification, the voice, 2114, the distinction between form and expression, substance, and how the organism, itself an articulation of the basic stuff of the Earth, morphologically shifts in relation to the full body of the Earth. As he talks, he becomes more and more nonsensical, unintelligible, incoherent, and ultimately alienating his audience, slipping the subjective cage that is the body, and melting back into the earth. As Challenger morphs into his own words, progressively turning from subject who speaks to pure speech intensity merged with the milieu, the plateau, or the lecture, much like its subject content, the distinction between form and expression, i.e., earth and the animal bodies that articulate the earth's geological forces, blends the distinction between form and substance. Chmslev, McLuhan, Baudrillard, on a number of interchangeable registers. Challenger, his lecture, the audience member, the author's Deleuze and Guattari, and the reader, all blur. One wonders, is this Deleuze writing through Guattari? Guattari through Deleuze? How about Fanny, who helped with the editing process? Is it Deleuze and Guattari with Fanny writing about Arthur Conan Doyle? Or about Doyle's character Professor Challenger, and imaging the character giving a lecture? Is it Deleuze and Guattari writing about themselves, as it at times seems, in the form of reimage and version of Doyle's character? Or is it their idea of their readers' troubles with their texts, that is, their idea of their self and their own enunciatory productions? Or something more? Like the assemblage which is always more than the sum of its parts, it's all of this and then some, and to reduce it to one or the other is misguided. It's a hypostational accelerator that chops up author and reader, lecturer and audience, speaker and receiver, self and other, fact and fiction, all into a melted mess. 5.2 For the sake of making a point, I will separate out the form, to put it vulgarly, the subject or speaker of Professor Challenger, and the expression or substance, to put it vulgarly, the subject content, i.e. the lecture. Subject content, deterritorialization, acceleration, and double articulations that choose or deduct from unstable particle flows, substances, which impose statistical order of connections and successions, forms, page 41, and stratifications or acts of capture, page 40, double articulations that create a merged relation between milieu and animal, each one being the articulation of the other, page 51, etc. and unending. That seems very much like the Landian notion our bright thinkers criticized, the idea that land collapses important distinctions. The plane of consistency knows nothing of differences in level, orders of magnitude, or distances. It knows nothing of the difference between the artificial and the natural. It knows nothing of the distinction between contents and expressions, or that between forms and formed substance, page 69-70. The act of collapsing concepts mimics the strata. The plane knows no distinctions. The subject itself requires more attention. I quote at length to capture the similarity to land and the CCRU. Professor Challenger gave a lecture after mixing several textbooks on geology and biology. The audience rather sulkily denounced the numerous misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and even misappropriations. He claimed to have invented a discipline he referred to by various names: rhizomatics, stratoanalysis, schizoanalysis, nomadology, micropolitics, pragmatics. Yet no one clearly understood what the goals, method, or principles of this discipline were. Page 41-43, to keep the last of the audience from leaving, Challenger imagined a particularly epistemological dialogue of the dead. We're a little lost now. There is so much going on in these retorts. So many endlessly proliferating distinctions. Page 46-47. Challenger admitted having digressed at length, but added that there was no possible way to distinguish between the digressive and the non-digressive. Page 49. Most of the audience had left. Challenger had changed since the beginning of his talk. His voice had become hoarser, broken occasionally by an apish cough. His dream was not so much to give a lecture to humans as to provide a program for pure computers. Page 57. We have to hurry, Challenger said. We're being rushed by the line of time. Challenger wanted to go faster and faster. No one was left, but he went on anyway. The change in his voice, and in his appearance, was growing more and more pronounced. Something animalistic in him had begun to speak when he started talking about human beings. You still couldn't put your finger on it, but Challenger seemed to be deterritorializing on the spot. Page 63-64. It was over. Only later on would all of this take on concrete meaning. The double-articulated mask had come undone, and so had the gloves and the tunic, from which liquids escaped. As they streamed away they seemed to eat at the strata of the lecture hall. Disarticulated, deterritorialized, Challenger muttered that he was taking the earth with him. He whispered something else. It is by headlong flight that things progress and signs proliferate. Panic is creation. No one had heard the summary, and no one tried to keep Challenger from leaving. Challenger, or what remained of him, slowly hurried toward the plane of consistency, following a bizarre trajectory with nothing relative left about it. He tried to slip into an assemblage serving as a drum gate, the particle clock with its intensive clicking and conjugated rhythms hammering out the absolute. The figure slumped oddly into a posture scarcely human, and began a curious, fascinated sort of shuffle toward the coffin-shaped clock. The figure had now reached the abnormal clock, and the watchers saw through the dense fumes a blurred black claw fumbling with the tall, hieroglyphed door. The fumbling made a queer, clicking sound. Then the figure entered the coffin-shaped case and pulled the door shut after it. The abnormal clicking went on, beating out the dark, cosmic rhythm which underlies all mystical gate openings, the mechanism, or Isus. Page 73-74. Mixing, collapsing, discourses, playing loose and fast with concepts, disregarding authorial intent, all to form a misunderstood discipline without tenets, dogmas, or oughts. A discipline where an audience is not needed, and where there is no attempt to convince another. And if there were another, it's certainly not human. The information is for a future machine. A means to break down in and through vocal passages as material forces, not significations, a breakdown into an animal past, a turn to goo in order to slip into the machinic time stream. Could this not describe Challenger and Land? Could it not map onto Land's oft accused of misappropriation of Darwin, D and G, etc., and accelerationism's constant misunderstanding by the media? It would even be easy to call Challenger, like Land, a sud who collapses distinctions and slips into incoherence, who overrides the games that Occidental philosophy obsesses over, and who, before you know it, is on the floor croaking into the mic. Some of us are still philosophers, you know. 6. Aesthetics and Hyperstition. 6.1 The plane of consistency knows nothing of differences. Then fiction and reality collapse into one hyperstitional intensity, one Gothic flatline, to use Mark Fisher's term. 22 If so what if Land collapses concepts and neglects the difference between and deterritorialization? If so, when Brassier says a conceptual incoherence emerges in Land's thought, this is not a sign of departing with D and G, and far from a powerful critique of Land. Rather, it's more like a metalinguistic artifact, an observation about Land's observation of the real, that directs us further into the Deleuze and Guattari of ATP, not further away. Let us recall that it is Deleuze and Guattari who implore us to bring something incomprehensible into the world. Such is the form of exteriority. Page 378. In fact, the theme of the incoherent is incredibly prominent in ATP. Modern philosophy, as opposed to romantic, tends to elaborate a material of thought in order to capture forces that are not thinkable in themselves. This is cosmos philosophy, after the manner of Nietzsche, the forces of an immaterial, non-formal, and energetic cosmos. This is the post-romantic turning point. The essential thing is no longer forms and matters, or themes, but forces, densities, intensities. The earth itself swings over, tending to take on the value of pure material for a force of gravitation or weight. Rocks forces landscapes through thermal and magnetic forces, non-visual forces that nevertheless have been rendered visible. It is now a problem of consistency or consolidation, how to consolidate the material, make it consistent, so that it can harness unthinkable, invisible, non-sonorous forces. Page 342-343. There is no longer a tripartite division between a field of reality, the world, and a field of representation, the book, and a field of subjectivity, the author. Rather, an assemblage establishes connections between certain multiplicities drawn from each of these orders. In short, we think that one cannot write sufficiently in the name of an outside. The outside has no image, no signification, no subjectivity. The book as assemblage with the outside, against the book as image of the world. Page 23. Is it by chance that whenever a thinker shoots an arrow, there is a man of the state, a shadow or an image of a man of the state, that counsels and admonishes him, and wants to assign him a target or aim? Page 378. A book, concept, etc., philosophical or not, does not represent facts about an outside world with a more or less clear degree of correspondence between representation and real. The book or concept is itself a machine part of the real that makes things happen in real time, not unlike how, as the legend goes, Lovecraft's fictional Necronomicon began to show up in various fictional universes until it began to be sincerely requested at libraries, booksellers, which lead it to be catalogued in Ivy League university records. 23. Following D and G now and ATP, Land is precisely attempting to leverage these diagrammatic forces to bring something unthinkable and incomprehensible into the world through hypostational literature as an assemblage with the outside, often in a way that is anti-state or anti-reterritorialization, patchwork. In fact, the critique that Land is unaware of reterritorialization which creates a fatal flaw or incomprehensible concept is, by D and G's own accord, an act of state-oriented or capitalistic reterritorialization. Nick, your concepts must make sense to us. They must pay careful attention to the rules that have been crafted in universities, between the right thinkers. Or so say the concept cops. Yes, in an odd twist, our critics seem to be trying to catch Land's arrow. 6.2 Stephen Shaviro articulates this well in his blog entry on Ray Brassia's lecture from which I extrapolated the introductory critique. 24 My own response here is an aesthetic one. Far from being a discrediting flaw, performative contradiction is actually a sign that something is going right. Arguments that end in performative contradiction are of course not necessarily right, but any line of approach that is right must necessarily lead to some sort of performative contradiction. This is because of the necessary inadequacy of cognitive categories to grasp and determine the real. It's a lesson we ultimately get from Kant, in spite of himself, and that becomes more overt in post-Kantians and in today's speculative realism. This is where we get the philosophical distratification of the transcendental empirical binary. Performative contradiction is an aesthetic condition, not an epistemological one. Epistemology, the first critique, and ethics, the second critique, are incomplete, and indeed they can only avoid collapse through the intervention of aesthetics, the third critique. It is an aesthetic act, an act of faith, imnon, that synthesizes and smooths over the rational and cognitive gaps. Shaviro goes on. I think that, as I argued in a different way in my little book on accelerationism, any such neo-aestheticism also implies a different theory of desire from the one we take for granted. Affirmationist and vitalist theory, and the radical negation of these that we find in its most virulent form in Land, and in a much more sophisticated form in Brassia, are united in that they both assume the infinitude of desire, and hence the inevitable discontinuity between desire, or desiring production, and its actual effects or consequences. Such is also the presupposition of the 19th and 20th century sublime, of psychoanalytic theories of desire. 15. The aesthetic is the fictional, and the fictional begets the functional. The fictional, not unlike the fictional ego and its narratives, is the synthesized experiences that escape hard and fast argumentation, yet makes things happen. 6.3 It's not that there is a hard limit where the subject dies, but a limit that is itself a point of propulsion into an hyper-unlife, an unlife that can only be represented ad hoc in the form of aesthetic experiences, or fictions that partially convey truths that, in being transcendental, cannot be formulated otherwise. A fiction is used to produce thought about the unthinkable, a gap which allows effect to be generated in relation to thought. As Masumi writes in his introduction to ATP, the question is not, is it true? But, does it work? What new thoughts does it make it possible to think? What new emotions does it make it possible to feel? The answer for some readers, perhaps most, will be none. If that happens, it's not your tune. No problem. But you would have been better off buying a record. 15. So, have a small plot of new, Nick, Land at all times to keep accelerating, and if this does nothing for you, it's not your tune, so buy another record. Conclusion on the order of concept. Reterritorialization can be conceived as both being a surplus that decreases as deterritorialized processes intensify and the charge itself towards those greater deterritorialized processes. If we assume this to be true, and consistent between D and G and land, and it is likely my work here has not convinced many, then one cannot claim land misunderstands D and G's reterritorialization. This gets us to the order of form. Land's accelerationist project is consistent with Deleuze and Guattari's project in that its core thrust is an anti-philosophical utilization of the concept not as a representation of thought tending towards greater clarity of thought and its object, but as a tool to dismantle the academic philosophical rigmarole, and a drug to induce encounters with the outside through aesthetic experience, an attempt to think the unthinkable, and illustrate that which is precisely difficult to illustrate through real fiction. This is essentially the content. Reterritorialization equals virtual deterritorialization, at play on a pragmatic register, and remember, form and content are interchangeable and collapse into one flat line. Given the Dionysian implications of this, drugs, literature, and music, all falling under the general umbrella term of aesthetics, it's no surprise that two Nietzschean aphorisms come to mind: to philosophize with a hammer and to write with one's blood. To destroy in order to make fictions real through the vital fluid of the body, not unlike a dark magic ritual, or, as we have aimed to show in this text, to philosophize with an electric guitar, or a jungle drummed machine. Dionysian or not, we should not police the interests of critics, for even an anti-philosophical or aesthetic project can be critiqued on a philosophical register if one wishes. However, for various strategic reasons, one should also be mindful of a project's style, goals, and methods if one wishes to introduce a critique that will take, so to speak. One would not criticize a horror film for its lack of romantic comedy unless one wished to truly introduce something incoherent, in a non-constructive way, into the conversation. In this sense, the critiques levied against Land are not likely to change anyone's mind. Not that we know this to be the critic's intent, nor are they likely to modify the concepts in a way that will make them better to adversarial parties. Therefore, we conclude, not without some level of unintended arrogant presumption, that there is little critical bite to the accusation that a project which disposes of the concept of incoherence and advocates for thinking the unthinkable is unthinkably incoherent and inconsistent with the sources of the concepts it makes use of. This kind of critique is, as Land discusses in his new center classes, the application of philosophical standards to a project that is attempting to go beyond philosophy. At the same time, if we consider the concepts employed by Land as if they were philosophical concepts, we see that the basics are at least in the ballpark of correct, so to speak, leading one to speculate that perhaps Land's critics confuse Land's oft provocative and poetic rhetoric for analytic argumentation, and confuse their own reactions to his rhetoric for objective shortcomings in his thought. Postscript. Towards a Guattarian future, what will become of representation when there is no longer a subject to record it? Felix Guattari 25. To unironically frame anything towards A is to contribute to stale, presumptuous, academic banality. Who are you to tell me where we are headed? Or that you have any say in the matter? And if everyone is claiming to work towards this or that future, which future will we end up with? If ever there has been a phrase oppositional to accelerationism, this is it. The future pulls us towards it through. We don't work towards it in words. Regardless, the phrase came to mind and seemed to fit, and thus, in line with our previous explorations of utilizing the limits of language to go beyond itself, I have used the impotent phrase to introduce a thought. That is, Guattarian future would precisely preclude any such notions of going towards anything via the form of impotent essays. Guattari knew the future pulls us towards it, and a Guattarian future is already partially here. Accelerationism has become a present future predicted by a past Guattari. Elsewhere, 26 I attempted to show that it was he, not Deleuze, who laid the foundation for what we know as accelerationism. It was Guattari who wrote into Anti-Oedipus the now famous phrase that launched 1000/X, and his research that led to the conceptual use of accelerationist language. Guattari's as signifying diagrammatics that conceptualized language as a materialist tactic of creating real effects. Guattari who wrote sci-fi, and conceptualized writing theory as a kind of fiction that could make time move in mad loops and create impossible, experimental realities, concepts that would go on to underpin, if not become interchangeable with, the CCRU's concept of hyperstition and Land's theory of templexity. Guattari who talked of exiting language, not unlike exiting politics, instead of engaging in impotent representational argumentation. Guattari who, in his last book Cosmosis, An Ethico-Aesthetic Paradigm, 1992, calls for an aesthetic paradigm of understanding, in human experience, not unlike the one discussed above. This is important to mention. The collapsing of concepts into a swarmed machine Nick Land is critiqued for, i.e., doing cybernetics with the CCRU as opposed writing about it. Amy Ireland's kind reminder to me that one writes alongside or with the CCRU, not on the CCRU, and many other things like this. These are precisely the kind of collective aesthetic experiences Guattari spent his life attempting to articulate through theory fiction. If there is anyone who did accelerationism, it was Guattari who, from his psychoanalytic practice, founded the discipline referred to by various names: rhizomatics, stratoanalysis, schizoanalysis, nomadology, micropolitics, pragmatics, as I aim to explore in my upcoming texts, which span politics and mental health, libidinal economics and the death drive, Guattari and psychoanalysis, and the occult, anti-psychiatry, and feminism. Non-reductive psychoanalysis, or schizoanalysis, is a way of doing accelerationism.